Good morning, everybody, and we are so pleased that you could join us today. We are going to be exploring how the ports are transforming their operations, how they're reducing some emissions, increasing sustainability, and then we're going to look at the highways and freight corridors and how they're maximizing efficiencies across the country. And then we're going to finish up with that last mile of delivery. So first, I'd like to introduce our panel, and we have a great lineup. So Chris Cannon is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Port of Los Angeles. Kevin Biesty is the Deputy Director for the Arizona Department of Transportation. Mark Williams is the Executive Deputy Director for the Texas DOT. And Kristen White is the Executive Director for the Connected and Automated Vehicles for the Minnesota DOT. So welcome everybody, and we'll jump right in. So first, we're going to start at the Port of Los Angeles. Now, I know you've been operating since 1907, and you are the largest port in the Americas. That's a considerable accomplishment. But can you carve that with such a huge operation? How do you weave enough sustainability into the operations to make a difference? And how are the technologies and green fuels being used to obtain sustainability goals?
Well, it's a big question, and there are a lot of different pieces to it. To start, we identify, well, first of all, we track all of our emissions using emissions inventories. So every year we figure out from every source, every piece of equipment, every ship, every train, truck, every piece of cargo handling equipment, everything, we figure out what the emissions are in a very, very detailed and painstaking way are coming from each of those pieces of equipment. And then based on that, we're able to target where the most emissions are coming from and where problem areas exist. And then based on that, we're able to identify programs, whether they be incentive programs or grant programs, or just working with industry to help them target sources that are high emitting. And it's worked. We've reduced since 2006 diesel particulate matter by 87%. We've reduced NOx by over 60%. We've reduced SOx by 98%. And it's been an extraordinary program that's been very successful. The problem, of course, is that we can't rest on our laurels. We have to move forward. Climate change is the real crisis facing the world today. And so criteria pollutants are only, part of the story. So we've been focusing on zero emissions. We've set zero emission goals for ourselves for our cargo handling equipment by 2030 and for our drayage equipment by 2035. And we started to really work regionally, and this has become an important issue for us, planning a lot with a lot of the people who are even on the panel today, and certainly many who are watching. We have to do some regional planning for infrastructure. How do we set up infrastructure to support the transition to zero emissions? We have to do it in a targeted, strategic fashion so that we identify goods movement corridors, for instance, and make sure that there's infrastructure along those corridors to support zero emission technologies or even just clean fuels if zero emissions aren't feasible. And then working with stakeholders to make sure we have workforce development to support and maintain that equipment. And then obviously just making sure, you mentioned all the different steps in the goods movement chain all the way the last mile, making sure that we actually have a thought process that allows us to move toward clean fuels and ultimately zero emissions in each of the steps, in each of the pieces of the goods movement chain. And so it requires a lot of coordination and work with stakeholders. But that's really the approach that we've taken, and we've begun to work with partners again, like many of the ones on the panel today, as well as others. So maybe that was a long answer, but you asked a lot of stuff.
Thank you, Chris. And it was a good answer. And now we're basically talking about coordination. I'm going to move on to Kevin. We're moving along, let's say the I-10 particularly. You have a huge multi-state effort going across the country, starting at the ports and moving the goods from there. So Kevin, I'm going to let you take the next step in this freight.
Thanks, Tracy. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so Arizona is part of a I-10 coalition, and with California and our partners on the west side of us, on the east side of us, and what we're looking at is how can we effectively use that corridor, which is a primary corridor to move freight from the ports of California across, particularly to the southeast. And we're looking at everything from congestion mitigation to truck parking to permitting for unified permitting to see if there's a way we can have that truck keep moving across each of the states and getting to where it needs to go. Looking at working with companies that are exploring alternative fuel trucks. We have Nikola that is building a facility here for hydrogen-based trucks. And so, we're trying to look at every aspect of which is in our purview to try to keep those trucks moving, keep the freight moving safely and effectively.
And this one it's kind of geared towards both Mark and you, Kevin. You talked about some of the efforts you're making to coordinate the efforts. How hard was it to actually get that coordination across the states? I mean, you made a pretty good inroad starting at the ports and going across 4 states to actually get permitting and regulations on the same plate. I mean, coming from a state DOT background myself, I do understand that takes some coordination.
Well, when we have really good partners like Mark at TxDOT and our friends at Caltrans and in New Mexico, we all want the same thing, right? Nobody wants to be the bottleneck. Nobody wants to be the one that, well, we require this special thing for this purpose. So when you have the same goal in mind and you have good working relationships, which many of the DOTs do, it's really not that difficult. Now, you do get into some situations where, our elected officials may differ on things, but I think we've been lucky that at least here in Arizona, the legislature and the governor trust our wisdom. So it hasn't really been that difficult.
Well, Mark, I'm going to move over to you. And I know on this coordination effort, I understood that it was one of the started as to getting platooning. That was one of the initial things when you started the I-10 coalition. I don't hear as much about it these days, but can you just tell me a little bit more on the operations as I come across over to Texas?
Sure, thank you, Tracy. And Kevin set it up really well on the overall scope and the purpose of the I-10 corridor study. And these types of pilot initiatives are very important for helping us begin to understand a lot of the factors that are involved to get to a point that I think Chris set up when he talked about the need for a regional and a strategic plan when we're talking about topics like autonomous vehicles, particularly in the trucking area, and electrification. And so we have a lot of common issues that we're dealing with. And as Chris talked about, there's certainly a strong willingness to jump into these partnerships together because we collectively along the corridor understand the importance of seamless transportation, particularly when it comes to trucking. And so understanding what goes on and what the needs are over at the Port of LA with Chris and his team and how folks like Kevin and Arizona and New Mexico are handling and processing those that freight and sending it on to Texas is vitally important. But we're still kind of in the piloting stage, right now. And you mentioned truck platooning, Tracy, and there has been a lot of interest in that. I think we continue to see some interest in that area, but it doesn't, in my view, at this point appear to be really the driving area of focus. I think that we're looking at understanding the opportunities when it may come to autonomous vehicles, and then we're also trying to look and understand the real logistical issues that we've got to tackle to address that and to address the fuel and the power side of the equation, particularly if you're starting to get into electrification and expecting or hoping that cross-country freight may be able to take advantage of that in the future. There's a lot of issues that we've got to begin to fully understand and address, and to take a strategic approach to dealing with them. Texas can't have one approach that's different than Arizona or New Mexico or California when it comes to moving freight cross country. And these pilot initiatives, like the I-10 corridor study, we're also here in Texas working on the Connected Freight Corridor project, which is what we refer to as the Texas Triangle, the Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio, to begin to better understand all of these logistical issues when it comes to just the full spectrum of freight operations, including first and last mile delivery as well.
Well, I'm going to touch back on some of the things you've mentioned, Mark, but right now I'd like to move on to Kristen. So Kristen, you've got that last piece. You're the one who is actually talking about personal delivery devices and actually getting them to the individual consumer. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone, for joining us at Infrastructure Week. This is such an important coalition that ITS America is building. And first, I'd like to focus on the fact that the last mile is, in fact, the first and last mile, right? You know, the threshold of our homes is really where freight comes to live and impact our lives. And so I'm really fascinated and pleased about the national and regional coalitions that are developing around the emergence of first and last mile technologies like personal delivery devices, or for those that are unfamiliar, kind of sidewalk robots. But there's so much more than a delivery robot, right? They can help advance equity, public health, sustainability, and safety, right? As far as equity, they can expand service in communities that might not have strong access to first and last mile delivery of goods and services. They can expand public health and safety in a COVID environment where we can advance autonomous and automated delivery. Certainly, sustainable technologies like PDDs can help us limit our gas emissions and impacts from greenhouse gases, and even advanced, battery powered or low emission vehicles in this space. And of course, with safety, right? If we're removing drivers from these environments and eliminating the impacts on the road system, that advances our national goals towards Vision Zero. So I'm really excited about the emergence of these technologies. They might not be fully wide scale deployed across the country, but the space over the last 15 months has enormously expanded.
Thanks. I'm going to circle back now, Chris, to you. You mentioned, and you did a great explanation of the sustainability efforts that you're doing, but can you go a little bit deeper into some of the transitions, some of the adaptations you had to make to achieve what you have been achieving?
Well, if you mean the programs that we did and how we did it, I mean, so for each of the source categories, we had to identify things that made sense. And again, for criteria pollutants, we did something like vessel speed reduction. That's an interesting program for ships. It's like your passenger vehicle. If you drive really fast to work or wherever you're going, 75, 80 miles an hour, you maybe hits a little more fun and a little more enjoyable, but your carbon footprint is not very good. If you slow it down to about 50, your carbon footprint is much, much better. You don't maybe get to where you're going as quite as fast, but it's much better for the environment. Well, for a ship, it's the same thing. It's just a lot bigger and the impact is a lot greater. So the ships come in real fast at 20 knots, 22 knots, sometimes what they travel at in the open ocean. We have them slow down to 12 knots once they get to within 40 miles of the port. And then for that last 40 miles, they come in at a much slower speed. The emissions benefit is dramatic. The impact, including greenhouse gas reductions, is dramatic because they use less fuel and they generate less emissions. We also do things like ask them to use ultra low sulfur fuel. That's something now that's required around throughout North America, but it started at Port of Los Angeles. And we have them plug into shore power, which is another thing that's interesting. When the ships arrive, normally they sit at berth, and while the ship is being loaded and unloaded, the auxiliary engines are still running. to support hoteling functions for the crew and for those that are coming on and off the ship as part of during the loading and unloading process. Those auxiliary engines generate a lot of emissions. So we actually, another thing that we pioneered was we developed an ability to retrofit a ship so that you could take a cord, it's a cable, and you plug it into shore power and you can turn off those auxiliary engines. And then it's dramatic benefit, up to a ton of NOx a day, and which is a pretty extraordinary amount of emissions. And so those are examples of things that we've done. We had a program to transition all the drayage trucks. Drayage trucks are the trucks that pick up cargo and move them in and out in the region. We transitioned them to all cleanest drayage trucks, the cleanest technologies available at the time. It was 10 years ago. And we then worked on programs with the Harborcraft and all the other ones. As I said, the problem is climate change. And so we now have to focus on getting them to zero, or to reduce fuel and reduce CO2 impacts. And so the solution there is a transformation, once again, of the equipment itself. We have to move ourselves away from combustion-based engine technologies and move towards zero emission technologies. We have to improve efficiency so that we reduce the amount of fuel use. We have a program with GE right now. If I were to ask you, and if you're not familiar with shipping, you wouldn't know the answer to this, but it takes about 15 days to come from China to the port of Los Angeles. If I asked you about when in that journey do we know exactly what's on each ship and where it's going, so we can figure out who's picking up what kind of customs, and so forth, what would you guess? A week, maybe even 2 weeks, right at the start of the journey, you would know? No, the answer is 1 to 2 days. That's when we finally know what is happening with each ship. Well, that's crazy, because then you end up with a scramble drill. If you're a football fan, you know what that means. And trying to figure out how to get all of this stuff set up. We've got a program now with GE where we have doing something that actually you figured would have been thought of before. It's a great big internet portal, and it allows everybody in the system, from the freight forwarders to the cargo owners, whether it be Walmart or whoever, the shipping lines, the terminals, the truckers, the customs folks, everybody can log in and they all see exactly what's on the ship, exactly how the ship is loaded, where things are going. So all sorts of planning can occur literally from the moment the ship leaves its dock in China. And so that allows us to be extraordinarily efficient with the way we unload a ship, the way we move it in and out of the port, and the way the cargo itself is moved out of the port. And so even that kind of efficiency has a big impact on greenhouse gas and on fuel use. And so these are the kinds of things that we're doing. And then I mentioned earlier, the coordination about the journey outward, in coordination with other folks like the ones on the panel today, to try and improve efficiency and transform that journey into a cleaner, greener route.
And that's one that I want to kind of follow up on with Mark and Kevin. You mentioned that some of your initiatives started with regulatory. You did some regulations, it sounds like, at the port that eventually became practice along the entire coast. Well,
first of all, may I correct you one thing? We're not a regulator. So we didn't do any kind of regulations. We did tariff changes, but in most cases, these were voluntary programs that we worked with stakeholders. So we don't have the ability to regulate. So I just wanted to say that.
No, and I'm glad you corrected me. But that was kind of the question of, is this more voluntarily, or is this something that you put incentives to adopt those type of initiatives?
Both, all of the above. There's some of them are purely voluntary. In most cases, incentives are what you want. Since we're not a regulator, the old carrot and stick idea, the regulator is the stick, we're the carrot. And so a lot of times we offer financial incentives, incentives for people getting quicker appointments to get in to pick up cargo, reduced fees for at birth, recognition. We have our vessel speed reduction program where I told you they slow down. We have a big recognition. They get a certificate and a little bit of money, but a big recognition program at the end of each year. So a lot of the shipping lines can use that to do for their marketing. It's a really good system, but yeah, it's mostly voluntary. It's mostly through coordination with industry partners and with the agencies, because we have to, the regulatory agencies, because we do have to figure out what their goals are and try to work with them to make sure that what we're doing can help accomplish those goals. And then the community, I mean, those are the different pieces of the sustainability, the social and economic so
Mark and Kevin, following up on that theme, I know that some of the initiatives you had across was like truck parking and stuff. Are you using initiatives or just because it's at the convenience, or how are you actually transitioning some of the best practices of assisting getting freight across the country?
Well, you mentioned truck parking. I think that's one of the things that we've seen through the I-10 corridor study and the connected freight corridor study and just our own planning efforts is that the truck parking facilities in the state are crowded, overcrowded at times, and oftentimes truckers with hours of service limitations are really put in a bind trying to understand and find parking and know where the availability of parking is. And so one of the initiatives that we do have with the I-10 study, as I mentioned, is improving our communication to the truckers themselves so that they have some advance notice of whether or not the parking facility, the truck parking location, 30, 50 miles down the road is going to have available spaces, or whether or not they may need to look for something before then. And that has not only operational benefits, it also has sustainability benefits as well when you don't have truckers having to search and hunt for things. But we're having to also look in the future as we're beginning the process of examining how we can improve our existing truck parking facilities. We're not only looking at it from the lens of a place to park for truckers, but in the future, when we start, seeing more electrification for long haul freight and automation, what are those truck parking facilities going to need to potentially accommodate in the future? Power supply is obviously a big one, and that's important from a resiliency standpoint as well as a sustainability standpoint. Those locations where future electric trucks may be seeking to find power, you've got to have confidence in the system to be able to deliver that power reliably. We saw during the winter storm that we endured some of the challenges with that, and those challenges aren't going to go away as electrical vehicles become more prominent and those vehicles generate loads on our system, particularly in our rural areas that weren't maybe originally built to handle that type of demand.
And then, Kevin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, as soon as I can find my unmute button, there it is. Okay. Yeah, and one of the one of the things we looked at with the truck parking is kind of like what Chris talked about with, when freight leaves a port in Asia, what's on it and where does it go? What we've been looking at also is if I'm driving out and I have hours of service, where are the parking spots that I know ahead of time I could reach and know it's available, rather than driving around trying to find a safe place to park. So that's part of that initiative, is to try to make it as effective and efficient for drivers to know, okay, I've got 3 hours left. That'll put me in Amarillo. There's there's 18 spots at this location. I can go there and rest. One of the challenges that we kind of touched on with, and Mark is right, we're trying to figure out the future, right? How do we build infrastructure to address our needs now and prepare for the future? The issue we face, and a lot of states face, particularly with electrification, is the ability to put this infrastructure within our right of way, because there is a federal prohibition that you cannot, that if you weren't grandfathered in by the Highway Act of the 1960s, you can't vend that type of service in your right of way. Now, I understand that FHWA has issued a memo that said, we've been down this road before. They can't override federal law. Federal law specifically prohibits it. So until we get our act together, or the companies and the utilities start working with the existing providers of fuel along the interstates and put the efforts there to get the infrastructure, partner with the truck stops and the gas stations and the providers that are already there. It's going to be a long time before you'll be able to pull into a charging station on Highway 60 in Arizona. So,
well, obviously, partnership is definitely a theme along our trip into the future. Kristen, I want to kind of the same question to you, but a little bit more on when you have the personal delivery devices, how do they interact with the existing infrastructure and landscape, but also a little bit of the same thing of they also need power supplies. And they're usually not gas.
Absolutely. And it's a fascinating $1 million question about how these emerging technologies interact with the built environment, right? And we can't speak to any, one industry member, but right now with the emergence of these newer technologies, personal delivery devices, they interact in a variety of different ways, but there are some commonalities that we're seeing. First and foremost is not to confuse them with automated delivery vehicles, which are regulated by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, and operate on the road system and would interact as a traditional, mind you, innovative vehicle. The personal delivery devices are a little bit different. They really interact with sidewalks, trails, bike paths, shoulders of the roads, crossing on intersections. And so it's fascinating because despite all of the commonalities of these vendors, they interact in very different ways with the sensor integration. Some of them use cameras, LiDAR, and other ways to detect objects. And one of the challenges we're seeing is that there isn't a standard in how they communicate their intent to different pedestrians, people who walk, bike, and roll. And there might be some opportunities to even understand how to comply with really important things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that people who are different road users and have different abilities have the ability to continue to interact in a traditional, safe, healthy way in our built system. I think what's really interesting is we're seeing some trends in how we monitor these devices, just as way as the NHTSA wants to understand the number of autonomous vehicles on our markets today. There is an interest from local governments to understand where these vehicles and devices are operating within their system to help manage it, just as Chris and Mark and Kevin want to understand what's happening to make their system more efficient. Whether it's on water or on a sidewalk, we need to have a way, some sort of mechanism to work together to promote interoperability. And like with most technology, there are variations, right, in the technologies used and the understanding of how these technologies are used. So it's fascinating to see some of these vehicles have even wheels that can go up and down steps. Talk about that true last mile delivery, right? Whereas others might just use a simple warning flag and alert someone if their good and package is delivered. Now, with respect to the infrastructure, that too is another $1 million question. So as a lawyer and policy strategist, I should probably go back into private industry and start charging for these services. But typically what we're seeing is a distribution center environment, right? Maybe even a mobility hub environment where the packages are stored at some sort of offsite location, but it can't be geographically too far. And those devices have to pick them up and then take them to the home, apartment, or facility that they're headed to. So we're really excited to see how these continue to emerge and what commonalities we're seeing.
Hey, and Kristen, just to kind of follow up with you on here, I'm going to work my way backwards now. From in this case, the first and last mile, but going back in, is you mentioned some of the different types of devices that are out there and things. How do these varying regulations, these varying models affect the regulations across even just jurisdictions within a state?
Well, we've all seen in these national webinars, right, the map, the infamous patchwork rainbow map from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, to the different regulations, policies, and guidance that are being issued. And I think what we're all recognizing in this coalition with ITS America and our colleagues at all levels of government and industry is there's really a few key things we need to focus on. Is policy and guidance needs to be interoperable, localized, and coordinated. And when I say localized, I'm not talking about sensor localization. I'm actually talking about the fact that cities, townships, counties really are the laboratories of democracy, and they understand what their community needs. Their transportation infrastructure are the best. So we need to respect the fact for local government to want to manage their curb space, their shoulder space, and have input on those policies while balancing the drive for innovation for industry to need to not have to comply with 20,000 different sets of regulations, which is just the number of cities of the first class in the United States. The second thing we need, obviously, is interoperability. Technology does not stop, as we know, internationally from country to country, right? Ships don't just simply end when they enter into, the American space. And so too, personal delivery devices, autonomous freight, they cannot be inoperable by going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So we, again, can't expect industry to navigate all this, but we can coordinate through federal levels of government, through ITS America, to understand where those consensus topics are. And with that, my third and most important point is coordination, right? So less than half of the US states have personal delivery device pilots. And some of them have laissez-faire approaches where they don't enact regulations, but they allow these devices to be out and about serving communities. While some states have very restrictive guidance, permitting, and oversight that can sometimes, the industry feels, stifle innovation. So again, as a lawyer and risk strategist, we need to strike a fine balance. And that is with coordination through coalitions like ITS America and in regional coalitions like regional states. MASTO, for example, where I'm from, we just started and concluded a 10-year strategic plan for automation and connectivity that shows that at least the 10 Midwest states have a plan on how we're going to coordinate on freight movement that's automated and connected despite the unknown future. Because again, these national and regional coordination models have to be the space where this work is going to take place. And I just want to finish with, it has to make sure we're including community voices and local voices as well.
Thank you, Kristen. And that opens me right back up to the states. As I'm coming back to when you talked about your coordination and your regulations across state, did you have to work to unify some of or work with the motor carriers to unify some of the trucking regulations going across, or on the permitting?
Well, I'll jump in first and let Kevin add to that. And yes, the motor carriers are an essential stakeholder in this process. We have to understand their operational needs along with their regulatory needs, and that communication and understanding is part of the I-10 corridor study, and looking at how we can have some commonality. But that's not a new issue. That issue has been around. It evolves a little bit as we start getting into the area of automation where that may be concerned. But I'm confident we're going to be able to work through that. There are differences in size and weight standards in states across the U.S. today in certain areas. But we managed to get through that. And I think, from my point of view, I think we're going to have that same opportunity and as we work through the automation side as well. But there's, clearly a role for, some of the coordinated planning efforts that Kristen talked about. And there's an important role for the administration and Congress at the national level to continue to work through these particular issues, and maybe set more common standards like we have on the interstate highway system as it pertains to size and weight that may be applicable as well to automation. But I'm confident we've got a pretty good track record in this area as an industry, I feel like, and while we've got work to do, I think we're gonna get there.
Well, I think you really hit the point I wanted to make, is that I know that for many years that the regulations between states has been unsettling. It has not been agreed upon by all the states. The fact that you managed to achieve a level of coordination on that specific point is a pretty big achievement in itself, all other of the aspects aside. So Kevin, can you add to that?
Yeah, so obviously the trucking industry is a valuable partner in this discussion. But like a lot of organizations or a lot of groups, they're not monolithic, right? When we start talking about sizes and weights and things like that. Even our own trucking association, they have members that want longer vehicles and heavier vehicles, and they have some that don't want longer and heavier vehicles. And once you start talking about, efficiencies with sizes and weights, then you bring in, the old industry of the railroad. They have a say in that. And as Mark pointed out, a lot of those weights have been frozen since the early 90s. And so again, not to put everything on the Congress, but if we're gonna look at making loads efficient across the board from coast to coast, it's gonna need their help as well.
Hey, Chris, we have a question for you in the question and answer section. And you mentioned 2 sectors of your operations which have zero emissions horizons. Can you see what portion of your total emissions do those portions represent, or what part?
Trucks, when we do our emissions inventory each year, trucks, that's drayage trucks, are the highest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our inventory. Now, I have to caveat that by saying we obviously are not tracking the ships all the way from China. If we did that, the ships would be the biggest. But we pick them up about 24 miles outside of our, as part of our inventory, outside of our port. And so from 24 miles in, and then we look at the trucks as they move around the region here, the trucks are number 1. You could say the ships are number 2 or number 1, depending upon how you look at it. Cargo handling equipment comes close behind for greenhouse gas. They're number 3. So those are the top 3, the trucks, the cargo handling equipment, and the ships. And so that's what we, of those 3, the 2 that we set greenhouse gas goals for are the cargo handling equipment and the trucks. And we can't get zero emissions for ships, but we can start to do things like I talked about, which are improve efficiency. And we're actually doing some testing and working with fuel cells and things like that. So it's not that we're going to ignore them. It's just that ships are the hardest to get to zero emissions. And so we do some testing for that. I did want to say one thing. I appreciate hearing Kristen's comments, and I wanted to pick up on something that she said. It's something that we're looking at as well. She talked about distribution centers, and she was talking about a different subject, but distribution centers are where the cargo goes to then be further distributed out to storefronts and to individual purchasers. One of the things that we've looked at in planning for zero emissions are those distribution centers. We believe that those centers can be hubs for zero emissions. We've set up a pilot program at the Port of Los Angeles where we have one of our terminals. It's a moderate sized terminal. All of the warehouses have solar panels on them. And so they collect electricity from the sun. It's stored in big, huge industrial sized batteries, 1 to 2 megawatts in size. And we've got 2 of them that are part of the test. And then all the equipment at the terminal can plug in even at night when the sun's not out and run zero emissions. The model works well for a distribution center because all the equipment that runs inside that helps to unload trucks and so forth can all be zero emissions and can be powered in this way. And then when you run from a distribution center out to commercial storefronts and so forth, that equipment can be zero emissions as well. You've got a pretty short duty cycle there. You don't have to drive long distances usually because the distribution centers are located in areas that are near where their distribution source or distribution locations are. And so we're looking at those kinds of hubs as well as ways to begin to introduce zero emission technology, and not just all along corridors, but even in those hubs. And I just wanted to pick up on that because I think that's a really important thing.
Oh, thanks, Chris. And Kevin, I'm going to go back to you. I have a question here on the I-10 corridor, and it says that they're presuming that there's the same traffic choke points as other places in the country. Is there any activity to explore managed lanes for multimodal intelligent vehicle operations along the corridor? And then, Mark, you can see it coming to you right after. So Kevin's on the spot first.
So yes, I'm looking at that question right now. Yes, we are looking at V2I and V2X technologies along certain corridors. But again, as you pointed out, or somebody pointed out, the FCC has been kind of threw a little monkey wrench into that. But the answer is, particularly in the urban corridor with the Maricopa Association of Governments and the Pima Association of Governments, which are two major MPOs in our area, we are looking at technology to help move the traffic more efficiently. On the urban freeway, we used, ramp metering, we have loop detections, we, track times. We have variable speed message boards in certain areas for when traffic conditions warrant, we could lower the speed limit. So the answer is yes, we continue to look at technologies to help improve the flow of traffic. We have looked at managed lanes that would work primarily better in the urban areas, but people get a little worried when we start talking about tolling or things like that. Though we have the ability to do toll and congestion pricing and stuff like that, the general public and some of the local elected officials have not grasped onto that yet. And quite frankly, being from New York, traffic is not at the level where people, like in the DC corridor, are sitting for long periods of times. In Arizona, is if you're going 40 miles an hour, people consider that traffic. So.
And Mark, do you want to add anything on that? Is there any thought of different managed lanes in Texas? You did mention your triangle in the corridor before.
Yes, certainly. I want to first start by, noting, some of what Chris talked about those, those distribution centers and these intermodal hubs really being the opportunity to, I feel like, to build out the electrification and the automation, because you have some controlled environments there where you have some of those opportunities to have some flexibility to implement these systems that you don't have when you start getting into some of these broader environments. But I think one of the next links in the chain is going to be these, semi-controlled highway corridors and our managed lanes, our HOV lanes, provide that potential opportunity for some movement of freight, particularly in our urban areas. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is a huge destination for distribution of freight. And you've got areas in north of Fort Worth with the Alliance Trans Park and South Dallas that is just, full of distribution centers. And throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area, those are all largely connected by managed lanes, HOV lanes. The managed lanes could be both tolled or non-tolled. We're trying to kind of work with our elected officials on the terminology there, that there's different ways to manage traffic in these managed lanes, not necessarily from tolls. But those do provide excellent opportunities, and those are areas that we are looking at, particularly in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, about how we can utilize that infrastructure maybe during off-peak time periods for repositioning or moving freight in an autonomous environment in the Metroplex area. So I think we've got some real good promise in that regard.
I also wanted to, got a few questions here coming up, but I also wanted to bring in, you mentioned before that ice storm that hit Texas and literally put down, lost electricity for days, depending on where you were located. As we move to a different type of fuel economy, and this will be actually, this will all be to Kristen, to you, but how does this affect as we use more electric motors? We have more extreme weather, we have greater temperatures, both ways, extreme heat, extreme cold, we have dust storms, and things that would interrupt the power flow. So particularly as we move towards it, how do we transition towards it, and how do we help mitigate some of that?
Absolutely. Those are one of the really important challenges that we have if we're going to see the opportunity for more widespread use of electric truck operations in the long haul component of freight distribution, and it also applies too for even personal and passenger vehicle travel. There's got to be that reliability and availability of power along our rural interstate corridors, and we'd like to kind of point out with Texas that we're the largest rural state in the country when you look at rural population and as far as that's concerned. But yeah, it's a lot different if you've got trucks that may be unfortunately stranded due to extreme weather events or other types of hazards that we see on our transportation systems. And if it's a matter of finding them fuel and getting a tanker truck out there to fuel those trucks or to refuel a truck stop that can then be used to power those trucks, that's still a lot easier done right now than getting power out there and being able to repower some trucks that may be stranded in certain areas. We've got to kind of work through how that comes about. And I think the trucking industry itself has got to have confidence that the infrastructure is there to support and sustain them, even during extreme events when we're dealing with some of the uncertainty that's going to always be inherent with our transportation system, is how quickly can we recover and how quickly can we get our systems back and operational. And addressing those challenges as far as EVs and autonomous vehicles are concerned is an important hurdle, if you will, or challenge or opportunity to really being able to see widespread deployment.
Tracy, I'd like to add to that. I think Mark is spot on. I'd like to expand it even further with two ideas, starting with this concept of we must build for tomorrow today. Our infrastructure is at or near the end of its life cycle. We cannot continue to operate and maintain. We must, as we say in Minnesota, we cannot eat all our kernels and expect to harvest a corn next year, right? We need to invest, and we can do that in a few ways. One is we need to understand these different scenarios. And so through scenario planning and long range planning for all of our organizations, we need to identify these resiliency, sustainability, equity, safety, and automation scenarios like AASHTO and states in the Midwest are doing, and that was demonstrated at last year's Automated Vehicle Symposium, to understand what the futures may or may not look like. And instead of picking one of those futures and only planning for that future, which is what we did 100 years ago, we need to plan and prepare for multiple unknown futures. And the second thing, as the only woman on the panel, infrastructure also includes caregiving infrastructure. None of us can do this job if we don't invest the people and the families that make it happen.
Well said, Kristen, well said. Circling back on there, I do have a couple questions, and as we start to wrap up here, and Chris, we have some questions on the substantial nuclear Navy. We have some questions on nuclear freight movement. So why not a nuclear merchant fleet? You've had substantial nuclear Navy since Atoms for Peace program.
That's the question is I'm sorry, I thought you were going to ask other questions. I tried to answer one of them. Nuclear power is very clean. It actually works really well from an emissions perspective. It's a very, very promising technology. It's used in a lot of settings. There's just one really, really, really big caveat, and that's that they haven't been able to figure out what to do with the waste. And so until you figure out what to do with the waste, I don't know if it's a great solution yet. I think we continue to work on it. And I think that we figure out, ways to deal with or to use the technology. But until we can figure out what to do with the waste, and I'm not a fan of burying it deep in the ground somewhere. I just don't know that's a very good thing to do. I think that just basically is like doing this with, problems. And so I'm not a believer in that. But if you could solve that problem, nuclear power is really clean. And so, I think it's worth further study and consideration for sure. But we got to solve that big problem. And
Kristen, I'm going to come back to you. And I was actually where I was headed when with Mark after that is, we talked about the electric on the field on there, but also the PDDs use the electric field, but you also mentioned the interaction with people. You have all the people on the sidewalk and the caregivers. So actually, I know you mentioned briefly before is looking at some kind of method of operation that they have so consistent, so that you don't end up with a standoff between a PDD that isn't going to move forward versus perhaps someone in a wheelchair who can't move forward, or a blind person who's not sure of what's in front of them.
And this is where I'd actually circle back to some of the notes that my colleagues raised earlier, is that's where a uniform framework can be most helpful, right? It's very unlikely we'll see any federal regulations on this topic, nor am I really advocating we need more regulations to innovate. However, I do think that we as a coalition, industry, research, government, and community can come together to come up with some uniform principles. And that's where ITS America, for those that are interested in learning more, the standing committees are doing an enormous effort to build consensus items across different sectors, and then really dive into conversations when we can't agree on a topic or a policy issue. Why not? And really driving down. And that's really coming up then with some of these guiding principles that we're seeing emerging across states, AASHTO and ITS America, and even the Auto Alliance for passenger vehicles, that are really helping drive how we address those really challenging questions, Tracy. And I think what's really exciting is we're seeing more interest in national coalition efforts to do this. So as the chair of the ITS America PDD task force, please join us. If you have folks in this network, they need to be a member of this ITS America coalition. There's my plug, everyone, for the week.
Well, thank you. I'll pay you off later. Is there, I've got one last question, then it'll be, then we'll do a lightning round last part. Is there any hope for ITS enhanced longer combination vehicles to improve freight efficiencies for the vast majority of highway freight that hauls less than 80 pounds for the gross vehicle weight limit? Kevin, are you able to handle this one?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, you have a lot of interests that need to come together and agree upon that, because like I said, even the trucking industry isn't in complete agreement on longer combination vehicles or higher or lower weight, because businesses have different business models, right? Every company may have a different model, more trucks, less trucks. So I'll leave that to the trucking industry. But then again, as Mark pointed out, different states were frozen at different combination and weights back during Ice-T in the early 90s. And so again, not to punt to our friends across the Potomac, but, Washington's going to need to step in, and then, bringing the trucking and the rail industry into a room and coming up with agreements. It's possible.
And thank you. We are coming to the top of the hour, so one very quick going around. What do each of you consider the biggest challenge in moving forward? You've mentioned all great things, and certainly working together in partnership is a big one. So Chris, I will start with you, and again, work my way through the states back to Kristen.
So the question, to make sure I understand the question, is what are the biggest things we can do for partnerships?
What do you consider the biggest challenge to move forward?
Technology. I think it's just a matter of as I said, we have to make a transition away from combustion-based technologies and move towards zero-emission technologies, whether they're batteries or fuel cells or some other technology that somebody hasn't thought of yet. It's technology. We're still in the early stages of evolution of these technologies. A lot of people are relying on diesel equipment. It's been around for over 100 years and it's very reliable and it works, but we've got to move away from it. Greenhouse gas, climate change, biggest crisis facing the world today after COVID. We have no choice but to solve this.
All right, thank you. Mark, how about you? What do you consider the biggest challenge?
Sure, Tracy. I kind of look at it as a three-legged stool, and each leg kind of begins with an R. Responsibility, resources, and reliability. All of those components have to be addressed. And responsibility includes both the regulatory environment and the oversight and the jurisdictional issues that we have to contend with. Resources is not only financial resources, but space and capacity resources as well. And then we've spent a lot of time talking about reliability. We've got to have a reliable system. You know, I think we as an industry have probably, you know, addressed or in the process of quickly addressing 80-90% of those components, you know, where we are today. But that last 10% sometimes requires about 90% of the effort to get us all the way there to that 100% goal, because we really got to be at 100% to really be able to see the deployment in the transportation technologies that we're talking about with respect to autonomous vehicles and electrical vehicles or trucking, in particular with the long haul component. So my 3 R's would be the ones we've got to continue to work on.
Thank you, Mark. Kevin? Oh, you're on mute.
Can you repeat the question again? I was typing something.
Just what do you consider the biggest challenge in moving forward on this?
On this being our future transportation system?
Basically on sustainability and the transformational part of moving forward.
Well, I think, you know, and I kind of typed it, you know, I think this is my personal opinion, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that there's one solution. You know, we have an issue here in Arizona right now where we have a copper mine that they're trying to open and they're not able to open it. And as far as I know, I'm not an expert, but we need copper if we're going to have electricity fueling our system. So, you know, I understand the clean air. I want clean air, but that requires digging into the earth for certain minerals and solar panels. And, you know, I had a buddy of mine had to get rid of some solar panels and he couldn't just take them to the dump. They had to be taken to you know, they had to be, it's like toxic waste kind of thing. So, you know, we have to look at redundancy in the system, no matter what we pick. We're facing it now. Somebody mentioned about the cyber attack on the fuel line. You know, it doesn't take much for people to start panicking. We had a pipeline bust here, the Kinder Morgan pipeline a few years back, and people panicked and went out and just started filling their tanks, every tank they had, and put you know, it's kind of like the toilet paper in 2020, right? The whole system kind of broke down because demand shot through the roof. And there was no need to panic, but people panic. And the whole fuel supply for Arizona was driving around in everybody's vehicle. So whatever the future transportation system is, we can't just rely on one answer. It's got to be redundancy. There has to be a way that if the grid shuts down, there's a backup. If the pipeline shuts down, there's a backup. So resiliency, redundancy.
Thank you. And Kevin, I think that actually that's a perfect intro back to you, Kristen, as you mentioned before, different scenarios and making sure that we considered all the scenarios. And it also brings in Chris' point of having to have the whole system look together. So Kristen, I'm going to let you do the wrap up.
What I heard today, Tracy, in this conclusion is we need a coordinated national vision. Last year, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials conducted an exercise where we reviewed the number of regional and national coalition efforts on this topic, and we found over 51 different committees and different stakeholder groups talking about this work. That cannot continue. We need coordinated national support and support from all of you on the call today to join us as we align these efforts, come together with a common vision and compete and far exceed Europe, Singapore, and the global environment so that the United States can be the leader in a coordinated national vision for sustainable, smarter, and greener transportation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well
And
said,
everyone,
that did it.
and thank you all. You guys have been a great panel and we really appreciate the conversation you put on here. So that concludes our webinar for today. And thank us again.